Yes.
First of all, by God deliberately sending the flood, and then by the time you get to Genesis chapter 8, God says to Noah, from now until the world ends, you'll have cold, you'll have heat, you'll have summer, you'll have winter. The climate will go up and down. And what's interesting is, as you follow that progression, cold is never mentioned before Noah's flood.
Mm-hmm.
Heat is never mentioned. Seed time, harvest are new concepts after the flood.
Yes.
By the way, it means that you've now got half the time to grow twice as much because you can't grow your crops in winter. And the animals start to struggle, and now you have survival of the fittest. So if you're Charles Darwin and you assume it's always been survival of the fittest,
Right.
you'll be logical and you'll be wrong.
Right.
Because God was there and you weren't.
Is it right to say that there's very probable that there wasn't rain either, because there was just this mist before the flood?
Yeah, the interesting thing is the only mention to rain before Noah's flood is Genesis chapter 2, where it says in verses 4 and 5, and there was no rain.
Oh, it actually does say that.
It says that's emphatic.
You mean
there
that
was
scripture
no
again?
rain.
Genesis?
Okay, read Genesis chapter 2, put it in context from verses 3 down to verse 6, and you will get the context of, and there was no rain.
Brilliant.
So you can argue, well, there must have been rain, but your biblical data doesn't mention rain next until it fell for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, you've heard of Job?
Yes.
Okay, in the book of Job, you'll find he uses phrases like, my friends are like thawing ice. Now, the only way that's meaningful is if he'd seen ice. And you find snow and hail first come into existence in the book of Job. Then you find Abraham has to pack up his bags and leave Canaan for decades because the whole country has been subject to a drought. So you will find that the climate has gone from good to bad to worse to London. And this idea that this is the worst it's ever been is simply false.
Right.
As I keep telling people, the politicians will never solve the problem of global warming, but they will find new ways to tax it. It's the most convenient system they've had in a long time because they can blame you. You're old enough to have been in the 1970s, aren't you?
Absolutely. Go back to the 1940s, mate.
Well, we won't go there. That's too far back. But you only need to go back to the 1970s and pick up your National Geographic from 1976, right? And it's got in there a problem. The world's going to die of cold, right? Because for 20 years, the temperature had been plummeting down. But as the editor of the old Punch magazine said, the only thing to be learnt from history is nobody's learned anything to be learnt from history. We've forgotten all of that. And now for the last 30 years, it's started to go up by 1 degree or so. Right? The Stern report talked about ½ degree over the past 50 years or so. Now that's not impressive, but it's politically correct, and it's politically incorrect to actually oppose it. But then that's what God's called me to be sometimes.
Right.
So actually this is all available on DVD, so I'll get you to hold that up. There's a lot more on there beside. You know how polar bears are being used to promote this idea? Because they're going to become extinct if the ice floes melt, and they won't be able to hide from the seals to catch them, and the seals pop up, and it'll be your fault, your car's fault, etc. Well, would you like a little secret, Howard? The seals are looking forward to that.
All right.
Nobody reports it from the seals' perspective. And I was in Alaska. I've been in Alaska many times, and you really do get worried about those big polar bears, but you find out one thing. They come from the black bears, and you can breed them anytime you want. It really doesn't matter at all if you run out of the last natural polar bear. As nasty as that might sound, you can start again with the black bears, and the Indians call them spirit bears because they actually start black and they come white. But then you've seen people do that in England. Start brown, end up black or white, and it took 1 generation, no evolution at all, nothing to do with the climate, and certainly nothing to do with cows or cars.
Just tell us a little bit about the DVD, so that people can get.
Well, they can. That's available now from our
this.
English office, which they can put up, which is where my itinerary for the next 2 months is on, and that's www.amen.org.uk/creation research, if I've remembered that accurately, right? And it's a great hour looking at lots of things like, what does Islam say about global warming? What does the Bible say about it? What is the scientific data? What about that emotional issue on polar bears? We actually go to a lot of trouble to show you that the polar bears actually do come from the black ones. And, of course, you can't read DVDs, but you can watch them out.
Yes. No, what I'm trying to do is just make it a bit more interesting, the shot.
Oh, right, okay, that's good. But we've had an incredible response to that all around the globe, because it takes off the political glass and gives you the big picture across the whole of history from the time God created the world. You need the big picture. Do you know what half the problem is? Do you remember when Francis Bacon wrote his book on science? No, you weren't old enough for that.
No, I wasn't. Yeah, and I didn't even go to school, so I wouldn't.
1604, 1605, but since then, scientists have regarded their scientific techniques as the way of finding things. So the interesting thing is, prior to the 1600s in England, it was much warmer. And then you find there's a couple of hundred years where there's incredible cold, and the Thames used to freeze over every year. But the last time the Thames froze over was 1814, and it was thick enough then for them to hold their frost fair. Hasn't been thick enough since, and you can't remember when it's frozen over, correct?
No, never.
Okay, so the scientists have been plotting the temperature in that warm period since the scientific methods start. But look, if you go to a high school, Howard, and you're a student, tell me who you think's got the best reputation for facts, the scientist or the historian? Isn't it the scientist who's up there? We want to be political scientists. We want to be economic scientists. We want to be psychological scientists. The historian, I'm sad to say, has not got the same reputation because he hasn't made anything happen much.
And he's not around to argue.
He only reports what's supposed to have happened. But here's the dilemma. All of the records about the climate being warmer than it is now come from historical records, and we need to take them into consideration. In fact, I'll share a funny story. I was talking to a guy from Iceland, and I said, "Why did you settle in such a stupid place?" And he said, "That's because it wasn't covered with ice when our ancestors first settled there." And the interesting thing is the data has just come to light to show that that area was warmer as well. They drilled a hole all the way down through the 2 kilometres of ice in Greenland, and underneath it is the remains of spruce and alder and all sorts of pine trees, etc. It used to be green. And now the Greenland government is looking forward to all that ice melting, because they're already doing a deal with Alcoa to give them, you know, the best smelting system in the world for totally green energy as all that ice melts.
Right. So this, looking at the near future then, there's no reason to be alarmed at what the scientists are saying, not the historians, about the rise in the sea temperatures, etc.
There's two ways that we need to take this, and one is the biggest problem with the whole global warming scenario is it says it's the motor car, it's the cow, it's the farmer, it's you, and you're altering the weather. And one scientist in Australia who's a regular skeptic said, you know, if we can get tomorrow's weather forecast right, then I'll start to believe we can influence it. You see, the Bible says God is ultimately the one in charge of this world, not the British government, not the United Nations, and he is the one. In fact, it's a promise. When I moved out of the city into the country, I really became aware of the promises of God concerning the weather. Like 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, if I shut up heaven so it does not rain, and da-da-da-da, away it goes, then if my people which are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways. This is not a verse given to prostitutes or unbelievers. This is to supposedly godly people who are not living for God. And then I'll hear from heaven, then I'll hear the land. And my experience is that's exactly what God does, because he's ultimately in charge of the weather. So there's the first side of it. The other side of it is God made man in his image. We're not sort of overgrown, hairy apes that have lost their hair and grown bigger brains. We were made in the image of God, and we were given dominion over the planet. Now, with kingship comes responsibility. You remember when they shipped all those tourists to Australia in the 17 and 1800s free of charge?
Absolutely.
Now, we abused dominion to the nth degree. Our policy was, if it moves, shoot it. If it doesn't, chop it down, right? And you pay a price for raping the environment. So with privilege comes responsibility. If you want the responsibility to work, the privilege will be a blessing. If you don't accept the responsibility, the